Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University.
Welcome back to Civics in a Year. Today we have Sean Weinberg back with us because I feel like, again, at this point, it's just the Liz and Sean show. But we're talking about one of my most favorite presidents to study, Theodore Roosevelt, and also Woodrow Wilson and their political thoughts and what the difference is with them. So, Dr. Weinberg, when we talk about Teddy Roosevelt, we talk about Woodrow Wilson and their political thoughts, do they have any similarities or are they all differences?
They're more similar than they're different is the short version. And particularly after Roosevelt sort of Wilson either moves toward or reverts back to a vision that's closer to Roosevelt. So Roosevelt obviously is president first. He inherits the presidency after William McKinley's assassination. And I assume you know this, but Roosevelt was actually put on the ticket as a way to get him out of New York politics. So they thought he would be less dangerous as vice president. So I've seen in some of the historical accounts, like various political figures like, oh God, we're doomed. Like, what have we done? So don't get to this is a lesson to party leaders. Don't get too clever by half with your vice presidential picks, a la John Tyler, since I know you guys had Gordon Cash to talk about the sort of slight tactical miscalculation that one ended up being. So Roosevelt initially is, and as we talked about with the populism one, largely a sort of Republican regular. And when he takes over, as what I mean by that is he's not that different than other Republicans. He's not particularly progressive. He keeps all of McKinley's cabinet, in fact. But he starts getting more and more concerned. Like, partly he's concerned about a few Supreme Court cases that I think he exaggerates, but partly this is, and it's worth noting too, the New York courts are very aggressive in terms of imposing sort of laissez-faire libertarianism. The federal courts, not so much. So a lot of Roosevelt's, I would say, frustrations are he's taking nationally problems that are local to New York in some ways, or especially pronounced in New York. But Roosevelt basically seeks to have much more aggressive federal regulation over industries that he thinks are either particularly dangerous. So Pure Food and Drug Act, for example, is one, or connecting back to one we talked about earlier, antitrust. So he's aggressive about sort of reinvigorating antitrust. But constitutionally, in terms of federal power, what he actually does is mostly pretty cautious while he's president. He sort of runs his mouth about expanding it in a few ways, but his practice is generally pretty cautious. What happens that really radicalizes him is when he leaves office. As I like to darkly joke with people, some folks say, he seemingly loses his mind while he's off on safari. He comes back much, much, much more radical. And we'll talk about another podcast that's more about the personalities of the 1912 election. But for now, and we'll do another one on the presidential power. But for now, I'll focus on sort of his political economy that he adopts kind of in 1910, 1912. Probably his two most famous speeches, for those of you looking for the primary source, either New Nationalism, which is his political economy speech, or Charter of Democracy, which is his speech basically arguing for a much more robust rethinking of constitutional institutions. But effectively, the through line through certainly 1910, 1912 Roosevelt is he argues that the Civil War was about unjust economic privilege, i.e. slavery. You're working without being paid for it. And so he argues that the federal government must, like it did during the Civil War, destroy special privileges. And so he's very skeptical of corporate power, particularly as a through line in this. A lot of these years, there's a concern about railroads. So he says we may need to nationalize the railroads, but preferably let's regulate them. And as he says, effectively, and this foreshadows the major difference between Wilson and Roosevelt. Roosevelt says that the way out, quote, the way out lies not in attempting to prevent such combinations, meaning consolidated economic power, corporate mergers or something, but in completely controlling them in the interest of the public welfare. And so Roosevelt becomes convinced that the solution to the problems of political economy of the era is not to stop the businesses from getting big, it's to empower the federal government to get even bigger. And then in Roosevelt's mind, Roosevelt will be sort of empowered to adjudicate the public welfare. So he's very much assuming that there is a sort of homogeneous, discernible public welfare, and that he, as the president, will be well-versed to discern that. And then, and he wants to then empower the presidency as well. And that's a separate podcast, sort of his constitutional vision of the presidency. But he's increasingly skeptical of the separation of powers. He's increasingly skeptical of federalism. The 1912 Progressive Party platform has we want to regulate various things by the federal economy, by the federal constitution where we can, but we need to empower the feds if basically this is unconstitutional. So they don't explicitly say tear down federalism, but they're gesturing toward it. Roosevelt has a real skepticism of what he calls gambling in stocks, or making money instead of from services rendered. And this actually comes from the conservative political theorist Burke. So Roosevelt views himself not as a communist in this sense, but he says, look, there's something fundamentally different between a worker working and like a day trader making money. So this is something that comes from Burke. But you see this theme again and again and again in Roosevelt. The public welfare, stuff that doesn't advance the public welfare, needs to be pressed by the government. And so he wants to have the feds adjudicating labor and big business. He will occasionally throw in lines saying, yeah, big business corporations are terrible, but we also need to make sure that we're not supporting like labor radicalism. So he has no stomach for that. And he says he's increasingly impatient with the, quote, over division of government powers. And he nods to, and this is again something will be its own podcast, this idea of the stewardship theory of the presidency, that the president is empowered to act for the public welfare. And he also wants to have primaries with constraints on money in politics. So that's Roosevelt. So where's Wilson similar? So part of it's worth noting is Wilson has been he's been an academic. He generally writes like an academic. He's a little better than average academics, I suppose, but still not. He still writes like a professor. He talks like a professor. So he's been writing for decades about basically wanting to eliminate the separation of powers. And originally he wants a weak president, eventually, and a strong Congress. Eventually he decides that Congress basically can't be fixed and can't be dealt with. And so he wants to flip it and empower the presidency and the bureaucracy, which again will be in the presidency thing. So they both are skeptical of the separation of powers. That's a commonality. Wilson, however, adopts a vision that's called the New Freedom, as opposed to Roosevelt's New Nationalism. And this is very heavily influenced by Louis Brandeis, which is a name I assume you're familiar with. He's a future Supreme Court justice. Brandeis is interestingly an old William Howard Taft kind of supporter. So Brandeis is very much antitrust and anti-monopoly. So he is in some sense a kind of new Jacksonian, right? He wants to see power broken up and divided. He's big into federalism. Wilson picks up Brandeis and sort of adopts his vision. Scholars debate to what extent Wilson actually had been committed to this kind of decentralized federalism vision versus realizing that he needed to do that to win the Democratic Party primary, right? So that's above my pay grade. Did Wilson flip? Was he lying the whole time? But very clearly, Wilson in 1906, 1908 sounds very states' rightsy. 1912, he sounds moderately states' rightsy. When he becomes president, he moves from that. So originally, the New Freedom is supposed to be antitrust, anti-monopoly, tariff reform, reduced tariffs, and banking regulation. And as he says, it's less about the distribution of powers of the government, which is Roosevelt's concern. He wants to shuffle. Is this Fed or state? Is this, President, Congress? And Wilson says it's more about societal forces, that we now have a world where scale means the employer doesn't understand the worker, and scale means employers are able to push politics. Push influence politics in ways that seem unsettling. So the core vision is that Wilson wants to use, at least in 1912, the power of the federal government to break institutions up. Roosevelt wants to use the power of the federal government to be a steward and a guard of basically big institutions. Now, Wilson, once he's president, very famously, he does the tariff reform, which is mostly pushed by a member of the Senate, Oscar Underwood, but largely ends up adopting many of Roosevelt's policies, which infuriates Roosevelt because most of Roosevelt's House intellectuals all jump ship and say why they like Wilson. So that's a sort of awkward thing there. But so at the time, if you look at the newspapers, they will regard Wilson as like the moderate conservative, Roosevelt is the radical, and Taft is just sort of out there doing his own thing. I don't think it's fair to say Wilson is an actual conservative in 1912. He looks like it by comparison to Roosevelt. But again, constitutionally, Taft is the conservative, even though policy-wise, again, all three of them are moderate to radical progressives in some, not radical, but moderately radical progressives. But their real difference is constitutionalism. And that'll be its own separate podcast.
When you say the term conservative, does that have the same meaning that it would today?
Broadly speaking, broadly speaking for most, Roosevelt wants to say that he is the conservative because he says, I am trying to undo basically aggressive corporate power. And so there is a wing of progressives. And so there's a long debate. In fact, my colleague Aaron Kushner and I had a peer-reviewed article recently where they basically insisted that we add a long paragraph on like, what is a progressive? What is a conservative? What do the progressives mean? Right. And so I could bore you to death talking about that. But broadly speaking, it has a similar meaning. But the one thing that's striking is that today, policy and constitutional views are collapsed. Mm-hmm. And at the time, I would say that most folks are constitutional conservatives, even if they are policy progressives. So they say, we should interpret the Constitution. They don't use the word originalist, but basically like as the founders would have understood it. But different political economy means that we can regulate things differently. So if you want to ship something across state lines, an originalist would say the feds could do this. Mm-hmm. So if you want to be a big multi-state corporation, you by definition are effectively consenting to more federal power, even if it's the same understanding of the Constitution. And so that split, it's a great question. And that split ends up largely explaining why Roosevelt's cronies, which we'll talk about in a future podcast, at least the fun parts, all bail on him because they say, look, we're policy progressives. We like the Pure Food and Drug Act. We like, the Mann-Elkins Act. We like the various federal regulations that are legitimately about dealing with interstate commerce. And these are good, but this doesn't mean you can regulate local governments, local policies. And this doesn't mean we want to destroy the separation of powers. And it doesn't mean we want to play around with some of the most radical forms of direct democracy that Roosevelt plays with. I mean, in the Charter of Democracy speech, he suggests that judicial opinions should be able to be recalled. Now, originally, he's talking about that as a state issue, but clearly it's a stalking horse for feds. But he basically wants to say, some people are mad at the courts for overly expanding the due process clause. We've talked about that, substantive due process, and they're sort of reading in economic views. And so the position that like Oliver Wendell Holmes and others take would be, let's constrain it to basically say due process is about process, not about us imposing our economic views. So that's the kind of moderate corrective. Roosevelt wants to have voters just say like, nope, we don't like that opinion, thumbs down, which freaks Taft out, not unreasonably, because Taft says, what do you do if they just strike it down, but not the precedent or the reasoning? And now we have sort of conflicting lines of doctrine. Like, this isn't how courts work. See Federalist 78, basically, is Taft's take here. So yeah, progressive and conservative, at least on the constitutional grounds, broadly mean the same thing. And to the extent that it's more or less regulation, it has sort of a similar continuity. But again, even folks who we would code as sort of moderate conservatives recognize they need to make more regulations in the wake of this economy. So like Coolidge actually looks, when he's in state government, foreshadowing a few podcasts from now, Coolidge looks like a moderate progressive in state government and then looks more conservative in when he's in federal office. William Borah, who will come up in the next podcast as a senator, is the same thing.
And you talked about Woodrow Wilson being a professor. Woodrow Wilson, to this day, is the only president who had a PhD, and his was in history and political science. And maybe this is an opinion question, but do you think that, him having a PhD and him having, I looked up his dissertation title. His dissertation was Congressional Government, a Study in American Politics.
Yes.
Do you think that having that kind of an educational background influenced him, but then once he got into the presidency, things kind of changed? Because when we look at him and Roosevelt, they're two very different people. And educationally, again, president, there is no, in the Constitution, there is no educational requirements, but to have a PhD and to be, a president of a university, he was trying to get a law degree, like he was doing all of these things. How do you think that influenced him in his presidency?
Probably for the worse, but is the glib version, speaking as somebody in that profession. I would actually push back on the question a little bit.
Okay.
So he is the only one that has a PhD. He is not the only sort of academic or scholar, since he's getting play now because of Death by Lightning. There's like a Netflix series about Garfield. Oh. Garfield is a wildly, one of the real tragedies in history is Garfield getting assassinated. Not just because Garfield is basically a brilliant academic. He's a president of a college at one point, and he does. You can read up just like how intellectually impressive it was. He created new proofs of geometry. He was, I would argue, much more brilliant than Wilson, if we want to measure on that metric.
Interesting.
I would also argue that Roosevelt doesn't have a PhD, but Roosevelt is somebody who, on the side, writes history books. He knows a lot about history. So they're both actually pretty scholarly in some sense. To your point about Wilson specifically with the graduate degree, I would actually argue that in some sense, it makes him less effective as a president, partly because he studies at Johns Hopkins. Mm-hmm. Hopkins is mostly staffed by people who had gone and trained in Germany. And so that's where he kind of picks up a lot of his views about kind of teleological progress, like Hegelian, and this is all sounding super boring, and it is, but he basically picks up this vision that history is moving in a singular direction and it can be directed sort of by great people. And similarly, that there's a sort of skepticism he picks up of American institutions. And so that I think will connect to the one we talk about the bureaucracy and executive power. But Wilson's academic scholarship is not about how much he loves the constitutional institutions. It's very much picking up this sort of kind of proto-deconstructionist stuff from the Germans. And so that's why his scholarship is very skeptical of the separation of powers. And then when he's president, he very much is skeptical of separation of powers. So I don't think it's an issue of that he gets elected and he changes, because now the boring professor suddenly has to confront reality. He never really confronts reality in some ways, which is partly why he's so disastrous in foreshadowing, trying to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles stuff, because he has a sort of a pompous academic's take on I'm smarter, I know better, I don't need to negotiate with you people. So I think that makes him in some ways less effective. He's able to push through things where he has broader consensus stuff, but a lot of his things don't go through, or they're sort of very quickly yanked out. So no, I am not advocating PhDs as an essential qualification for academia or for the presidency. There are political figures who have been scholars who I think are pretty great. I'm not going to rattle them off here, but again, it's also worth noting just the education system back then. Folks that just had a BA had a better understanding of the Federalist Papers than many of my colleagues in grad school exhibited. Coolidge can name drop the Federalist Papers with comfort and ease in a way that folks in grad school today probably cannot. I mean, you've looked at
like
you've looked at those old, like, take the exit interview, the exit test for like 7th grade folks before, and like, damn, this is PhD level work.
It is. And I love that we got off on this tangent, because now, like, I'm looking at friends at, UVA's Miller Center have something, James Garfield, the education president. So I guess that's my next rabbit hole to go down. Dr. Weinberg, thank you. Thank you for also going on our little side quest on, education and presidents, because again, I just think these things are interesting. I'm really looking forward to our next podcast. We're talking about the election of 1912. So all of these figures, we've talked about, we're going to really get into some historical drama, which we all know is my favorite. So Professor Weinberg, thank you.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.